Welcome to the Peak of Geek, where we've hit the top but with no plans to stop. If you grew up in the 90s and had a fascination with things that went bump in the night, chances are pretty high that you were also a Goosebumps fan. Whether you watched the massively popular television show or read the books it was based on, I'm sure the works of R.L. Stine has crossed your path, since he spent the last 40 years scaring children and young adults alike with so many books and series, it would make your head spin. Stine may be best known for Goosebumps or maybe even Fear Street, but he's written so many other series, one-offs, spin-offs, and so many more. Back in 2016, he was quoted to have written over 300 books, and it's only grown from there. At 80 years old, Stine is still writing, and his latest Bumps series is called Goosebumps House of Shivers. But does Goosebumps still hold up? Some of those early books absolutely terrified me as a kid, but is it still effective all these years later? Well, fear is an interesting thing, and following the works of Stephen King, Goosebumps arguably helped popularize the horror genre by introducing kids to it and making them lifelong fans. It's hard to convey how popular Goosebumps was in its heyday, but it's easy to see why. Horror was typically a genre that was reserved for teenage first dates, adrenaline-seeking adults, and everything in between. But it wasn't something that was typically enjoyed by children. But Stine, in the middle of writing his Fear Street novels, which were aimed at teenagers, was asked to create something similar for preteens. Stine said he would only do it if he could come up with a suitable name. And while perusing a TV guide one day, he found an ad for a horror movie that used the now iconic word, Goosebumps. While the Goosebumps series was, and still is, crafted to be those first few careful steps into the horror genre for preteens, I still find many of the stories enjoyable to this day. I'll be the first to admit that my enjoyment of Goosebumps is fueled partly by nostalgia and partly by the amazing cover designs of the original series from artist Tim Jacobus, who always went above and beyond with his illustrated interpretations of each story. Famously, Stine and Jacobus both worked on a tight deadline, delivering a book a month during production of the original 62. Because of this, Stine could only provide Jacobus with a short plot synopsis of what each book would be about, giving Jacobus the artistic freedom to create whatever he thought would work best. And that's why occasionally the cover art wouldn't match up exactly with the story found within, like with Don't Go to Sleep, which actually doesn't feature any giant monsters. But hey, you have to admit, this cover makes you want to see what happens. I mean, each cover begs you to open each book, with the incredible juxtaposition of vibrant colors, strange warped perspectives, and occasionally horrifying imagery. The Haunted Mask and Night of the Living Dummy are timeless pieces of scary art. But more on Slappy in a bit. Speaking of timeless scares, I personally feel that many of the scenarios depicted in Goosebumps books oftentimes incorporate themes that are universally frightening, regardless of how old you are. Many of the Goosebumps stories star a protagonist who, for whatever reason, feels alone. Whether they're in a family situation where the younger or older sibling is given more attention, like in the Cuckoo Clock of Doom, or if the main character just moved to a new town or school, like in Welcome to Deadhouse. Those feelings of isolation that can come from not being the center of attention anymore, or being thrust into an unfamiliar situation, can be scary, or at least uncomfortable. Of course, as we get older, we do become better at coping and handling those situations, but for many of us, it can still be tough. Most Goosebumps stories also feature situations where something incredible or unbelievable is happening, like when a ventriloquist doll comes to life in Night of the Living Dummy, and oftentimes, the parents or the friends of the main character do not believe the fantastical things that are happening. These feelings of not being believed or trusted in an unknown situation would be frustrating or alienating. It can feel like a sense of betrayal or a loss of trust. Other Goosebumps books show the main character in a location that's supposed to be fun, but it turns out something isn't quite right, like in Welcome to Camp Nightmare. That feeling of dread that comes with being trapped in a situation you know is strange without a way out is a scary thought. Okay, sure, as an adult with a cell phone, it's a little less scary. But that may not always be the case. I mean, what if you find yourself in an unfamiliar setting in the dead of night, completely alone, without cell service. Now that's true fear. But when it comes to things designed to scare you, I would argue that books often do it best, since other forms of media, like scary movies, are usually trying to scare us with a significant disadvantage. Anything a movie shows us will almost always be less scary than what we picture in our minds. That's not to say movies can't fill us with a sense of fear, with some masterful uses of suspense, with music, camera work, and atmosphere, but the eventual payoff will often be a bit of a letdown, because rarely can anything match the fear we create ourselves. Of course, a movie can also be lazy and startle you with a jump scare, but that's not real fear. Playing a scary game can also be quite effective, since as the player, you are somewhat in control of the narrative. You ultimately make the decision to explore that dilapidated apartment building looking for clues to solve the mystery. Again, atmosphere is key, and some games are fantastic when it comes to setting the stage for some truly frightening set pieces. However, with books, not only are you controlling the action in that you are the one turning the pages, everything, and I mean everything, is left up to your imagination. It's just you, the book, and the descriptions that lie within. And if you're reading late at night, it can be dark, quiet, and sometimes absolutely suffocating. If it's a particularly quiet evening, and the only sound is you turning the pages to find out what happens next, that can be pretty powerful, whether you're reading the works of Stephen King or R.L. Stine. The other thing about fear is that it's uniquely personal. As someone who watched scary movies when I was way too young, like Child's Play and Dolly Dearest, that prominently featuring a doll coming to life, the Goosebumps version, Night of the Living Dummy, was just as scary to me. I've since conquered my fear of dolls, but I owe part of conquering that fear to reading the Night of the Living Dummy trilogy and watching its TV adaptations. This helped desensitize myself by interacting with less scary variations of my fear. I mean, if I'm being honest, I've actually done a complete 180 when it comes to scary dolls. These days, I actually love Chucky and Slappy here. But I have promised my partner that they must remain in storage until October. So after this video, I will put Slappy back so he can continue to plot his violent, vengeful plans for when he's finally released this Halloween!
This is why the doll rule exists!
Yeah, okay. Anyway, in retrospect, it's actually impressive how much R.L. Stine got away with when it comes to scares and Goosebumps. He's often said that he purposefully strayed away from real-life horrors to focus on ones that are fantastical or science fiction, and usually kept the story's characters out of situations that were too serious. That's not to say people don't die in Goosebumps, but it's usually someone from the past who has come back as a ghost, or someone ends up eaten by monsters or something, therefore incorporating those elements of fantasy so it doesn't feel too real. It also helps that many Goosebumps stories prominently feature Stine's trademark humor, which helps balance the tone of the story from becoming too scary. Unfortunately, as is the case with many Stephen King novels too, many of the Goosebumps TV adaptations are significantly less effective when it comes to scaring the audience. Part of this can be attributed to the show's low budget, inexperienced child actors, sorry baby Ryan Gosling, and baffling decisions to change scary moments from the book to more lighthearted or just plain awkward ones in the show. To be fair, some of the episodes found in the show's first season not only adapt the source material well, but create a pretty scary 20 or 40 minutes of TV. The Haunted Mask, Stay Out of the Basement,
Stay out of the basement!
and Welcome to Camp Nightmare are all worthy adaptations and worth watching today if you're in the spooky mood, especially if you scare easy. Still, I will always argue that the books reign supreme, especially the original 62. Over the years, there have been several spin-offs and other series, and while I haven't read all of them, I do remember falling deeply in love with the Give Yourself Goosebumps books. These books were very similar to the Choose Your Own Adventure series, where the reader is involved in the story and its eventual outcome by following instructions found at the bottom of each page. Like if you want to go into the scary mansion, turn to one page, but if you'd prefer to chicken out and go home, turn to another page. The Goosebumps variations often boasted over 20 endings to find, begging for additional rereads until you found them all. And if you were an avid Goosebumps reader, sometimes books contain trivia questions to test your knowledge, along with cheeky little references and monster guest appearances. Even as a kid, I always found these books to be more funny than scary, but it was always exciting to see how many ridiculous ways each story would end, and try to find the rare good endings where everyone makes it out alive. You know, I'm still surprised how long it took for a Goosebumps movie to hit the big screen. That's not to say attempts weren't made. Throughout the early to mid-90s, when the original books were flying off the shelves, famous filmmakers like Tim Burton and George Romero were reportedly in talks to write and direct a Goosebumps film. Romero, who was best known for writing and directing zombie films like Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead, originally wanted to adapt the book Welcome to Deadhouse, which would have lined up perfectly with Romero's style. Not much is known about Burton's version, other than the fact that there were significant development struggles. Creatively, producers could not agree on what the movie would be about, since each book typically featured new characters and monsters, outside of the few that received direct sequels. It also never got off the ground due in part to the legal battles happening at the time. Starting in 1996, publisher Scholastic and developer Parachute Press began disagreeing over who had the rights to the Goosebumps trademark and merchandise. It was eventually settled by 2003, but it effectively halted any plans at the time for a feature film. However, in 2008, news started bubbling once again that plans for a feature film had restarted. Eventually, they settled on a more meta take, with Jack Black playing a fictionalized version of R.L. Stine, and the monsters from his books have come to life. While the original books managed to balance horror and comedy, and the show went for a more comedic, campy feel with elements of horror, the film went for a far more comedic approach, made more obvious with the casting of Jack Black. Personally, I thought the movie was a bit all over the place, but it was fun and charming to see so many iconic monsters on the big screen. The sequel, Haunted Halloween, was a bit meh, since they decided to drastically cut down the Goosebumps monsters, and instead decided to feature more stereotypical Halloween monsters, which I found a bit boring. During production of this lesser sequel, one of the working titles was Goosebumps, Welcome to HorrorLand. Oh man, if the movie could have been set at that haunted theme park, that could have been amazing! Maybe one day. Speaking of HorrorLand, I'm so glad Stine would go on to write a series all about that awesome haunted amusement park. The one downside is the borderline terrible tie-in video game that hit PS2, Wii, and DS. While it's kind of endearing to walk around the titular HorrorLand theme park, it wears off pretty quickly when you realize all you do is play janky minigames. This may also be nostalgia talking, but technically we already got this game back in the 90s with the FMV adventure classic Escape from HorrorLand. Okay, the puzzles in this game are super easy if you're not the target age demographic, but the decent performances from the child actors you may realize, combined with some sequences that are genuinely scary, make this one worth checking out. The mummy fight and the werewolf chase terrified me as a kid, and you could totally see why. This game also has some serious star power behind it, with Steven Spielberg helping DreamWorks Interactive on the production side, and Jeff Goldblum of all people appearing as Count Dracula. I mean, it's worth a playthrough just to hear him try and get his lines out with those fake fangs in his mouth.
My beauty.
Somehow, Goosebumps is still around. Stine is still writing new books, and a brand new TV series just hit Disney Plus last year, with a second season on the way. Unlike the original series from the 90s or the recent movies, this one decided to go with a more serialized approach. The story is an original one that gives me Nightmare on Elm Street vibes, you'll see why if you give it a watch, but it also prominently features classic Goosebumps monsters, objects, and themes. The series also wisely decided to focus the story around a group of high school age teens, so the scares could be a bit more age appropriate and effective. Overall, I thought the series worked well, and I'm looking forward to a second season.
Viewers beware, you're in for a scare.
You know, I feel pretty fortunate to live in a time where Goosebumps is still around. As a horror junkie, I still enjoy reading some of those old books. Sure, it won't give me literal goosebumps anymore, but like any worn paperback filled with memories, it's nostalgic and cozy. Except Let's Get Invisible. That book is just plain terrifying. But what about you? Did you grow up watching or reading Goosebumps? Did you enjoy the movie or the latest TV series? Let me know all about it down in the comments below, and until next time. So I have mixed feelings about AI art, for all the obvious and not so obvious reasons, but I kind of love the AI generated Goosebumps books covers that kind of blew up on the internet a little while ago. Most of them were pretty funny, but for whatever reason, this one is my favorite. Ham. Hey, hope you're having a super awesome day. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you so much, and I'll see you real soon.